Okay. So have you ever, noticed how cultural differences can really make or break relationships?
It's something we all encounter, right?
Totally. And it's not always easy to navigate. So we're diving into this podcast concept, Crossroads, navigating cultural differences in relationships to see if it can, shed some light on all this.
Yeah, it's a pretty catchy title, right?
Right. Makes you want to listen, see what they have to say.
For sure.
So they've really structured this podcast in a thoughtful way, which I appreciate. They start with the basics in episode 1, Introduction to Cultural Differences.
Which makes sense. You got to start somewhere, right?
Exactly. And get this, they're bringing in a cultural anthropologist for this first episode.
Oh, wow. Okay. They're not messing around.
Right. They're going deep from the get-go. It's not just surface level stuff.
I like that. I'm already intrigued.
Me too. And then in episode 2, they get into common cultural clashes, which, let's be honest, we've all experienced in some form or another.
Tell me about it. Those can be awkward, to say the least.
Right. What's considered polite in one culture might be totally off-putting in another.
Absolutely. And I think this is where having that strong foundation from episode 1 will come in handy, you know?
Totally. Understanding those underlying cultural differences can make a huge difference in how we interpret those clashes.
100%.
And for this episode, they've got a relationship expert lined up, which makes sense, right? Get someone who's seen it all on the front lines.
Yeah, I bet they'll have some interesting stories to share.
Oh, for sure.
So it's like they're setting the stage with the theory and then bringing in the real life application.
Exactly. And speaking of real life, episode 3 is all about the role of communication, which, let's be real, is at the heart of so many relationship issues, cultural differences or not.
Oh, absolutely. Communication is key, right?
Totally. But I think what's interesting here is how they're specifically looking at it through the lens of cultural differences.
Yeah. Because even something as simple as how direct you are with your communication can vary widely from culture to culture.
Right. Some cultures value directness, while others see it as rude or confrontational. It's fascinating.
It is. And you know what's smart about this episode? They're bringing in a communication specialist.
Okay, so they're bringing in the big guns for this one. I like it.
Yeah, it shows they're really trying to provide practical advice, not just general observations.
Totally. And then, because it's not all about just the couple, right?
Yeah.
Episode 4 dives into family expectations and pressure, which, let's be honest, can be a whole other beast.
Oh, yeah. Families can definitely add a whole other layer of complexity.
Right. What happens when your families have different expectations about, I don't know, how often you visit or who gets to make the decisions?
It's like a recipe for disaster if you're not careful.
Seriously.
And it's interesting because this isn't something that's always talked about when it comes to cultural differences in relationships.
That's true. And it's not just limited to, certain cultures either. Every family has its own quirks and expectations.
Yeah, exactly. It's universal in a way.
For sure. And for this episode, they're bringing in a family therapist.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right. Because who better to unpack all those family dynamics? And then, just when you think you've got a handle on those external factors, episode 5 takes a more internal turn with identity and belonging.
Ooh, that sounds juicy.
Right. How does our cultural background shape who we are within a relationship?
Yeah, it's like how much of our identity is tied to our culture and how does that play out in the context of a romantic partnership?
Totally. It's deep stuff. And for this one, they've got a psychologist lined up.
Makes sense. Get into those deep-seated beliefs and values.
Exactly. It feels like we're moving from the practical to the more existential.
Yeah, it's a natural progression. You start with understanding the outside forces and then delve into how those forces shape us internally.
Totally. And hopefully it doesn't leave listeners feeling too overwhelmed.
Hopefully not. But even if it does, it seems like episode 6 comes in with a reassuring hug. Finding common ground is all about solutions.
Okay, so a little light at the end of the tunnel.
Exactly. They're bringing in a relationship coach for this one.
Nice. So after all that introspection, we're getting some actionable advice. I like it.
Me too. It's all about finding that balance, right? Acknowledging the differences without letting them become insurmountable obstacles.
Right. And that's where I think the concept of cultural competency comes in.
Oh, totally. It's not about erasing those differences, but learning to navigate them with respect and understanding.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance, right? Acknowledging the differences without letting them become insurmountable obstacles.
Right. And that's where I think the concept of cultural competency comes in.
Oh, totally. It's not about erasing those differences, but
Hmm.
learning to navigate them with respect and understanding.
Absolutely. And you know what I appreciate about this podcast? They're not shying away from the tough stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Like
Yeah.
episode 7, when differences become divisive. That's getting real.
Right. Because let's be honest, not all cultural differences can be reconciled.
Exactly. And it's important to acknowledge that
Yeah.
sometimes those differences can lead to deal breakers in a relationship.
Absolutely. And I think it takes a lot of maturity to recognize that and to navigate those situations with grace and compassion.
Totally. And for this episode, they brought in a conflict resolution expert.
Okay, so they're bringing in the big guns for this one.
Right. It's like they're equipping listeners with the tools to have those difficult conversations, even if the outcome isn't what they hope for.
Exactly. It's about giving people the skills to navigate those choppy waters.
For
Yeah.
sure. And it's interesting how, even in acknowledging that some differences might be irreconcilable, Crossroads still ends on a hopeful note with episode 8, celebrating diversity in relationships.
I love that because it's a reminder that despite the challenges, cross-cultural relationships can be incredibly enriching and rewarding.
Totally. And they're showcasing real-life couples in this episode, right?
Yeah. Which I think is so important because it's not just theoretical advice. It's about hearing from people who are living these experiences, navigating these dynamics, and coming out stronger on the other side.
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, look, it's not always easy, but it's definitely possible to make it work.
Exactly. And I think that's such an important message to put out there.
For sure. And speaking of putting it out there, they're wrapping up the season with a bonus episode dedicated entirely to listener stories.
Oh, I love that idea. It's like they're creating this space for shared experiences, a platform for people to connect and learn from each other.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying, we've given you the framework now, let's hear how these dynamics are playing out in your own lives.
Right, because everyone's experience is unique and there's so much we can learn from hearing each other's stories.
Yeah, it kind of brings everything full circle, right? They start with like the big picture of cultural differences, and then they dive into the nitty-gritty, and then they bring it back around to personal stories. It's like they're saying, hey, we've given you all this information, now go out, apply it to your own lives and see what you discover.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, it's about more than just romantic relationships, isn't it?
Oh, totally. It's
Yeah.
about understanding and appreciating the role that culture plays in all our relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Like with our friends, our coworkers, even just random people we meet on the street.
Right. It's about broadening our perspectives,
Yeah.
becoming more aware of our own biases, and, just being more open-minded in general.
100%. And that's what I love about this podcast concept. It's not just entertaining, it's actually trying to make a difference in the world, you know?
I totally agree. It's like they're saying, hey, let's have some real conversations about these important issues and see if we can't learn something from each other. And you know what? I think that's something we can all get behind.
For sure. So to wrap things up, it seems like Crossroads, navigating cultural differences in relationships, has the potential to be a real gem of a podcast.
Totally. It's insightful, it's engaging, and it's thought-provoking. What more could you ask for? So if you're looking for podcasts that will challenge you to think differently about the world around you, this one's definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
We have. But before we go, we want to hear from you, our awesome listeners. Have you ever encountered cultural differences in your own relationships? How did you navigate those choppy waters? Share your stories with us, because we're all in this together, right?
Absolutely. We can learn so much from each other. So until next time, keep those conversations going, keep exploring those differences, and most importantly, keep building those bridges of understanding.
Couldn't have said it better myself.